Thank you so much, Mary, and thank you all for being here at the start of an extraordinary three-day period. When we were planning this conference, we couldn't think of a better way to start it than with our alums who are, extremely accomplished in their fields, and we thought that for anyone who didn't know, and how can you not know, that our alums and the work that they're doing in the world and the Academy and beyond are the best kind of testament to what we do, to what we've done, and what we hope to continue to do. I want to first welcome you to the conference, free to be anywhere in the universe. It is international, it's interdisciplinary in the best of Black studies. Over the next 3 days, you will hear some of the most significant thinkers in the field as we explore, think about the contours of this place and space we call the African diaspora. As Mary said, this is the culminating event in the series of events that we've had celebrating 25 years of the Institute of Research in African American Studies, and it's the inaugural event for the new department. And I want to make sure everyone understands that the Institute isn't going anywhere. It's not that the Institute became a department. The Institute is still here, it's still thriving. We're going to be celebrating its 30th anniversary, its 50th anniversary. It's the sort of programming and research wing of the department, which is, the curricular wing and the degree granting part of this project that we do. We can't just do it with one, we're going to do it with both. In celebrating 25 years of IRAAS, IRAAS is founded in 1993 by Dr. Mannings Spirit. He came to a university, yes. He came to a university where various formations and attempts to create African American studies, from the very sort of early 20th century even, had been happening, but it was institutionalized in the form of the Institute of Research in African American Studies. Certainly in 1968, even student demands led to a curriculum in African American Studies, but the Institute, under the leadership and guidance of Dr. Marable, really gave shape to what Columbia's contribution to this field would look like, and we inherit that and we stand on his shoulders as a person who was a scholar activist, who believed in engaged scholarship, who took seriously our place in Harlem and in New York, but also in the world. He was inspired by the Institute of the Black World, and that vision, certainly informed him as he created the Institute. Many of the people you will be hearing from today were certainly students of Dr. Marable and are a part of what he used to like to talk about, a living history. There is a living legacy, and you will hear from some of them today. And then for the next 2 days after this, we'll be not only looking back, but as we are doing this afternoon, we'll be looking forward to the present, but also into the future, what we hope this field to be in the future. I just want to take some time to thank a few important people and institutions. First, I want to thank Mary McGee and the staff at the Forum for hosting us here and for being so generous and just gracious and easy to work with as we were planning this. I want to thank all of my colleagues who will be in and out because they still are teaching, but you'll get to meet them during this conference. All of them who began to plan this event at a retreat that we have. We have a yearly faculty retreat, and we plan for the long term, and they began to plan this retreat a while ago. I want to thank the conference organizing committee, Kelly Jones, especially Kelly Jones, who's been really did a lot of heavy lifting here. Sally Hughes, Zinga Fraser, Sean Mendoza, Robert Gooding-Williams. Of course, I have to thank, as always, Sean and Sharon, because we don't breathe without Sean and Sharon. And then there were, we can't do this without the resources to do it. A major grantor for us was the Ford Foundation, who in their own kinds of commitments to social justice in every arena, they really supported this conference, as did Humanities New York, as did the Barnard College of departments of Africana Studies and Department of Art History, Columbia School of the Arts, and the Collaborative to Advance Equity Through Research at Columbia. All of these institutions, organizations, foundations really got behind this project and supported it. And thanks to their support, things will not end here. This is just the beginning of a conversation, and we have some plans. So stay in touch with us because we want to keep you involved in those plans as we move forward. So we're going to start with a roundtable of our alums, and I'm going to introduce the moderator of that roundtable who can tell you some more things about these extraordinary, accomplished individuals sitting here. Zinga Fraser is an assistant professor in the Africana Studies Department and Women and Gender Studies program at Brooklyn College. She's also a visiting professor at the Institute for Research in African American Studies. She's the director of the Shirley Chisholm Project on Brooklyn's women's activism at Brooklyn College, and she's currently completing her book manuscript titled Sister Insider, Sister Outsider, Shirley Chisholm and Barbara Jordan, Black Women's Politics in the Post-Civil Rights Era. She holds a doctorate in African American Studies from Northwestern University, a Master's of Arts from the Institute of Research in African American Studies at Columbia University, and she's also a proud graduate of Temple University. So I'm going to turn it over to Zinga, and I look forward to hearing what you all have to say.
Good afternoon, everyone. Good morning. It's afternoon. It's 12. Before we start the roundtable today, it's just really important in crafting at least Thursday's events. It was important to myself as well as Dr. Griffin and those who were organizing was to ensure that we not only highlight our alums, but really also highlight those who are really in the trenches doing a significant amount of work, embodying the spirit of Professor Marable in terms of theory and praxis and thinking about the ways in which we create communities and engage in the issues of the time. And so the IRAAS Alumni Council was formed years ago by Professor Samuel Roberts, who convened a number of alums of saying, how can we be in contact with those who've passed on, as well as how can we engage the work of alums with the current body students at IRAAS? And so what we've been trying to do is continue to create an open space for current alums to promote their own work, to engage in active community around the issues that concern them, but as well as also provide support to IRAAS, whether that be in creating programs or developing ways in which to think about expanding the number of graduates and those who are attending IRAAS as undergrads. And so for those of you who are alums, please do not leave. If you haven't received an email from us or you haven't received an email from Sharon, please make sure that we have your information so that we can be in touch with you. And so today what we're going to do is I'm going to ask a number of questions, and we're going to have a conversation. Don't get too comfortable, but we're going to have a conversation, as my mother would say, a kitchen table conversation, and talking about the work that you're currently doing, as well as opening up for questions and answers, period, for us to engage with the audience. And so let me introduce our esteemed roundtable guests. We have Zahir Ali. Zahir Ali is the oral historian at Brooklyn Historical Society, where he currently directs the Muslims in Brooklyn Project, a multi-year public arts and history project designed to amplify the histories of Muslims in Brooklyn through the collections of oral history, a K-12 curriculum, an arts exhibition, and a series of public conversations and performances. He also co-produces and co-hosts Flatbush in Maine, which I've been on, Brooklyn Historical Society's award-winning award-winning monthly podcast, now entering its 4th year of exploring Brooklyn's past and present through scholarly discussions, historical archives, and oral histories. Formerly, he served as under the direction of the late Manning Marable as project manager of Columbia University's Malcolm X Project, a multi-year research initiative on the life and legacy of Malcolm X. Then we have David Johns, who is currently pursuing his PhD in sociology and education policy at Columbia University. Johns obtained a master's degree in sociology and education policy at Teachers College, Columbia University. He's also a graduate of the Honors College from Columbia. He just stayed here. He just loves Columbia University. In 2013, Johns was appointed as the first executive director of the White House Initiative on Educational Excellence for African Americans, initiative by President Barack Obama, and served under the last day of the Obama administration in January of 2017. Prior to his White House appointment, Johns was a senior education policy advisor to the Senate Committee on Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions under the leadership of U.S. Senator Tom Harkin. Johns was also a Congressional Black Caucus Foundation Fellow in the office of Congressman Charles Rangel. We have Megan Marcelin, who serves as the project coordinator for JLUSA's Working Future campaign, which seeks to dismantle barriers to employment and other collateral consequences of mass incarceration for people with criminal records. Previously, as the ACLU's policy research manager, Megan oversaw a broad portfolio of advocacy-driven corporations and workforce development agencies seeking to implement fair change policies. Her analysis of the legislative history was instrumental to the enactment of new legislation spearheaded by Vote LA. And Megan comes to this work because of her firsthand experiences of family in the justice system, which involvement led to the analysis of mass criminalization as an historic and ongoing assault on people and their communities that extends inequality and prevents liberation. Then we have Natasha Corgon-Core, who is a civil rights attorney and consultant. She served as an assistant counsel at the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund, representing Black voters and other voters of color in a number of cases brought under Section 2 and Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. Prior to joining the LDF, Natasha worked as an associate for Covington and Burling, and she currently works as a strategy consulting firm, serving a public sector sector organizations. Natasha graduated from Columbia Law School, where she is a Harlan Fiske Stone Scholar, and from Brown University with an AB in Honors in African American Studies and History, and she holds an MA in African American Studies from the Institute for Research in African American Studies. And then lastly, but not least, we have Carmen Thompson. She is an historian and an adjunct instructor of Black Studies in African American History at Portland State University. Dr. Thompson earned her PhD in U.S. History from the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, and a Master in African American Studies from Columbia University, where she was the recipient of the Zora Neale Hurston Award for the Excellence in Writing by IRAAS. Currently, she is a visiting scholar in the Black Studies Department at Portland State University, where she is working on her book, manuscript entitled American Whiteness, which explores the origins of whiteness in America. So as you can imagine, we have a treat today for all of these esteemed scholars, as well as policy workers, historians. So what I want to do is just start with the first question. Right? No one needs to hear me talk. One of the things that has had a profound impact on a number of alums and those affiliated with IRAAS is the importance that their work engages in both theory and praxis. In part, the significance of this concept was fundamental to Dr. Marable's student development and training, as well as the creation of IRAAS. So what does the theory of praxis and practice conceptualization mean to you first? And what are the ways in which it is significant to how we might address the important role it plays in confronting issues of inequality and injustice as it pertains to African Americans and those within the African diaspora? I ask this question because if you've ever had a class with Professor Marable, this idea of theory and praxis, I don't want to say was beaten into our head, because there was no kind of physical harm that was ever come to us. But this idea of theory and praxis was very central, and I think for some of the reasons of why we decided to come here. And everyone on this panel is engaging in what Professor Marable and others in the Institute will call liberatory work. And so how do you see the role of theory and praxis, and how does it connect to thinking about injustice and inequality? So it doesn't matter. You can start.
So I think one of the ways that I think about this is, I came to this unashamedly with community interest in mind. And I think sometimes people who do work on our community, we feel like we have to justify it as legit scholarship if we have a personal vested interest in it. Like studying yourself or your community does not somehow mean it's going to be rigorous scholarship. And I think the theory is very much informed by the lived practice. And that's something that I came away with, is that this is not abstract work. That the scholarship can and should be rigorous. It should critically examine the community. It should critically examine our life and history, but it should not be an abstraction. And we are not colonizers. We are not mercenaries where we go into the community and extract historical data or cultural data and then package it and sell it or use it for career advancement. Like, there is a real accountability that comes from maintaining a relationship with the community, of being in the community, acknowledging that you're a part of this community, so that if you attempt to sell the community out, you are really selling yourself. And so that's how I saw it and got it from my days at IRAAS.
Okay.
You better open a panel. I need a minute, go for it.
Why are you looking at me, David? So I had not been prepared to answer this question, but I will now. I just wrote down not abstract work because I think that is one of the fundamental lessons I learned from Dr. Marable and from IRAAS in general, right? This work is actually about liberation of people. And we have to have that fundamentally in our minds as we do this work. I work in criminal justice transformation, which is what I do not like the word reform, because I'm not seeking to reform a system that has criminalized, punished, marginalized, and repressed communities, particularly Black and brown communities all over this country for the last 60 years. But one of the things I have thought a lot about in my work is sort of a return to theory, because we lost a whole generation to political assassinations and to mass incarceration. That means a whole generation of minds that were creating theories upon which to build practice of movement. And so in this moment, and I work from everywhere from South Carolina to Louisiana to Michigan to Rhode Island, which is the most MAGA state I have ever been in. But in those moments, one of the things that I've realized is that we actually need to go back to the theory if we are going to empower people for a sustainable movement and not just moments. We need to go back to the theory if we are going to learn from from the movements that came before us and begin to see them on a continuum. We need to go back to theory if we are going to empower formerly incarcerated communities to begin to fight for their rights in their lives on their own terms, not ours. And so I've actually been thinking a lot about how we begin to do that, and we have been doing that. We've actually been creating small political education cells all over, from Columbia, South Carolina, to Flint, Michigan. We now have reading groups going on all over, and that has been an important part of bringing people together and also giving people the agency to fight for their rights.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'd like to build on Megan's comments. You know, just the term theory and praxis, that's Dr. Marable, you know, through and through, and it just warms my heart to think about that. But the thing I think about is a challenge that I remember him saying in our classes, one of the critical approaches classes is, what kind of scholar are we going to be? You know, why are we here learning all these wonderful theories? What are we going to do with that? And each one of us took upon that challenge in their own way, but it really impacted me because he set that to what was happening in Harlem, right? So we have this Morningside Heights campus, you know, and you know, below us, right? And very intentionally so from an institutional standpoint, there's Harlem, right? And we have all these theories that we're learning in Black Studies, and isn't it great that we're all here at Columbia? But what are we gonna do when we leave here? What is the information we're learning? How is that going to be applicable to the communities that we serve? And he challenged us, and he challenged it. I challenged myself, and that had the most profound effect on me. And so when I think about theory and praxis, I think about how is it that the theories that we are learning, how are they going to advance, liberate, and benefit the communities that we serve, live, and work in on a day-to-day basis? And that's everything for me, right? And it's about putting Black people and oppressed people in the communities that we serve front and center, but utilizing our theories to be able to support and to advance them. So, and we are in an institution like Columbia or various other institutions that we're in, oftentimes these theories that we're learning, I'm a historian in traditional quote unquote disciplines, are not theories necessarily to apply to people of color, for race, to marginalized and oppressed communities. But I see it as my job is to take that theory and flip it and apply it to the communities that we serve. So from the praxis standpoint, is taking the theories that we learn both in Black studies and in our traditional disciplines and utilizing it to serve the communities that we are interacting with on a day-to-day basis. And you know, Dr. Marable taught me that, and he challenged me, and I took it upon myself that all of this work we're doing in this wonderful setting and all this wonderful knowledge we're learning, if we're not using it to advance the Black community and the communities that we serve, you know, he would say, you know, he had some terms for that, but you know, all of us remember. But he said, are you going to be an ivory tower scholar? I remember him saying that. And that means, as Zahir was saying, you take it and you package it, and isn't this nice, and you're on TV, and you're a talking head, and blah, blah, blah. But what does that mean to communities in Harlem and in the communities that we're living in on a day-to-day basis? If it doesn't have any applicable meaning in people's day-to-day lives, you know, what are you doing here? And that was the challenge. And so I think that is one of the more important things I think about when I think about theory and praxis.
Okay, I don't know, is this on? All right. So, you know, when I think about theory and praxis, I actually think to what Dr. Griffin mentioned earlier, which is living history. And for me, living history was a huge part of what I was working on as a civil rights lawyer, primarily in voting rights. One of the factors in voting rights cases that you have to show in order to prevail is historical discrimination against the community that you're representing. And so I can't even tell you the number of times I thought back to everything that we learned when we were together here at IRAAS to be able to give structure to a story of a community and have and be able to do that in a way that would make sense to a judge that had no knowledge of the things that we talk about here at IRAAS and not necessarily any context for the things that we're trying to do, whether in a litigation or in a classroom here. And so living history is a huge part of what I think about as a civil rights lawyer, simply because it's a huge part of the civil rights cases that we litigate, in particular voting rights cases, where you really have to be able to show, and unfortunately it's not very difficult to show, the way that history has failed communities time and again in order to erode their political power.
Excellent.
I wanted to take a minute and allow them to go first, in part because it continues to be a privilege for me to be a baby of IRAAS. I was an undergrad when they were all.
Why are you trying to age us out?
I am paying respect and honoring those who have come before me.
I might have been your TA. Is
And
that what
who-
you're saying?
I didn't say you said it, but yes, that was accurate. And we joke. Natasha and I were talking earlier about like all of the silly things that we would do, including waiting for the moment when Professor Marable would hit the wall. And I'm smiling in this moment because, as Zinga said, so much of the work that we all do, and I think that everyone who is called home to IRAAS does, is so incredibly weighty work. It is difficult work. It is not sexy work. It is not popular work. It's the kind of work that makes you lose sleep and friends. And so for me, the space where theory meets practice is in the question of, so what, right? For me, it remains a question of, so what will you do with all of this privilege that you have inherited? These Ivy League degrees, this White House credential, opportunities to share space with some of the most brilliant people ever, and in ways that are very practical. And so I just want to tell a quick story for those who don't know that in 2004, I was forced to sit in the space between theory and practice when the convergence of ignorance and privilege showed its ass. I was a senior at Columbia, and there were 3 separate incidents that happened, starting with, or including an anti-affirmative action bake sale. Our marching band, which every year aims to be offensive, performs skits around Orgo Night, where their one goal is to offend everybody on campus. And on February 21st, 2004, the Federalist paper published a cartoon starring called Blackie Fun Whitey, starring Kunta Cornelius and Steppen. And for me, this was literally a moment where all of the things that we talked about interpreting Baldwin in only the way that Marcellus Blount could.
Yes.
Grappling with the teachings of Ella Baker manifested in a book club discussion based on Barbara Ransby that Farah, Jasmine, Griffin facilitated. Really sitting with all of these things that for so many people are just theoretical ideas, but we all know are things that actually make it possible for people to become liberated. And so I founded with some student leaders, some friends, colleagues, some who were in the room, Columbia University Concerned Students of Color, and gave up the privilege of simply being a student to engage in the struggle of trying to force Columbia University as an institution to change. In part because it didn't matter that I had the ability to be here and take up space if people who look like me and come from the communities that continue to conspire for our success had to deal with the same stuff. And that question stuck with me even after the time that I left Columbia, right? Institutions are mindful in knowing that students leave. They put things in place to allow them to be able to leave. And I spent time in Washington, D.C., crafting federal policy that was really designed to ensure that more Black kids that come from spaces like Inglewood, California, could take up space at Columbia without having to fight to be acknowledged after having done the work required to be there. If for no other reason that like we built it anyway, and we're almost always more brilliant than our colleagues, and because of structural racism and what Black feminists refer to as the matrix of domination, we deal with stuff that they couldn't even fathom dealing with every single day. And for 5 years, I had the pleasure of serving still my president, Barack Hussein Obama, in a job that I felt was built for me, where I was invited to be one of few black people who had a theoretical foundation upon which I could talk about the very real vestiges of white supremacy and anti-blackness. And then try and leverage federal resources to lead to meaningful and demonstrable change. And I can't even describe the feeling of being able to do that on behalf of the first black president and in service to our country. But what I will say is that, like, I'm still very much grappling with the fact that Trump has happened. And that every single day, things that I have watched so many people, including everybody on the stage and some people in this room, contribute to, be eroded. And for me, the hardest part of continuing to do this work is acknowledging that, like, we don't have a choice. And so it was important for me to say thank you for just allowing me to come into this space, because I just had a conversation with a mother of a young boy named Nigel Shelby, who got a call from a lawyer who represented Trayvon Martin's family. Because rather than being a freshman in high school in Huntsville, Alabama, doing the things that most white, straight freshmen get to do, he was bullied and beat up and harassed for being gay, black and gay, something that too many of us don't talk about. And as a result of it, he committed suicide. And the thing I struggle with is that I now lead an organization, the National Black Justice Coalition, that is the only organization in this country that is intentional and unapologetic in acknowledging the intersections of racial equity and LGBTQ equality. Because as long as there have been black people, there have been black queer people. And when we don't acknowledge it, the systems designed to oppress us take over. And while Nigel was sad, in 2009, there was another black boy, Carl Walker, who in 6th grade hung himself for similar conditions. And so for me, IRAAS is so essential as a place to remind the world, in particular anybody who wants to claim authority based on an institutional credential, that unless your work leads to meaningful and demonstrable change in the lives of people who will never be able to have access to the things that that credential provides, then it doesn't even matter.
Thank you. Woo. Wow. I think it's also, just by listening to the responses, it's important to realize, and I think I didn't realize how amazing a space IRAAS was until I left it. How in many ways we take for granted the things, the space, and the reasons why we see so many alums come back year after year, every year at the holiday party or whatever excuse to come back to IRAAS. And so I was also thinking about the ways in which, at least for me, coming to IRAAS was specifically grounded around the manifestation of seeing theory and praxis working as a congressional staffer who worked on Capitol Hill and working on nonprofit work before I started. This was not before, after, but before I started my academic career. There was a reason why it came to IRAAS, and it was specifically, I want you to think about or at least provide some connection. It's important to have an institutional historical memory. My question to the panelists is that, can you reflect on the influence of IRAAS programmatic initiatives, whether it be the long-standing conversation series that we have, or the former programs such as the Malcolm X Project, the Center for Contemporary African American History, the Africana Criminal Justice Project and Souls, the Journal for Black Politics. How did these programmatic initiatives influence your professional development, and where do you see the work of engaging in these kind of programmatic initiatives to go in the future?
I guess
Yeah.
I'll start. So when I was thinking about graduate school programs, And I technically am not an IRAAS alum. I should say that.
Yes, you are.
But yeah, I feel like I am.
My TA.
Yep.
That's why you got to say that. But when I was looking at history programs and I came to meet Dr. Marable, and he asked me what I was interested in. And I said, I wanted to do something on Malcolm X in Harlem. And he just like leaned forward, his eyes brightened, he had that big Marable smile, and he's like, well, you have to come here. And he's told me that he, for many years, had been trying to do this work on Malcolm X, and he hadn't gotten a chance to resume it. And he said, if you come, then, this will give us a chance to do it. And so in 2000, he launched the Malcolm X Project. And Manning was brilliant at these kinds of projects that were scalable, that were really nimble, that were fundable. Like, he knew how to articulate the project's objective to a foundation, to the university, to a nonprofit. Like, he just knew how to do those things. And I eventually became the project manager of the Malcolm X Project. And I came away with that. So I'm an oral historian. I'm at Brooklyn Historical Society, and most of the work that I do involves projects that are funded, that require fundraising. So the first thing is that IRAAS was very entrepreneurial. IRAAS married the best of the critical racial justice lens of W.E.B. Du Bois and the practical institution building skills of Booker T. Washington. Manning found that intersection, and it was incredibly entrepreneurial. It was very much, and that entrepreneurial spirit allowed for an organic growth of these projects that might start as an idea, that might start as an article in Souls, that might start as a conference, that might start as a seminar, that he may look at as class and see certain students gravitating to a topic. He would task them to develop it. And so it was very, it was a free space where you could, it was like what they would call an incubator. It was like a lab, a workshop, where you came, and he allowed all of these spaces, and not just him, but certainly I was here when he was the director, but then when Farah and Stephen Gregory and Marcellus Blount, like all of the faculty that gravitated to the Institute shared that spirit of entrepreneurialism. And so I came away with like a real practical experience of how to develop a project, how to explain that project to different kinds of audiences, how to scale that project, how to raise money for that project. And these are like skills that no graduate program is really going to teach you. Like, I feel like I'm so far ahead from many of my colleagues who graduated from the history program because they did not have that practical experience of developing projects and programs. But the other thing, of course, is this. So Manning tragically passed on April 1st, 2011, just a few days before the Malcolm X book came out. And as one of the few people who worked with him on it, that was left in the city, I was asked and accepted the responsibility of being able to talk about the project and the work of his book to audiences. And if anyone's familiar with the book, there was some controversy around it. Just a little, just a little. But this is so interesting, and I was like, Manning, even from the grave. So Manning was, he was very, and he cultivated the spirit, and this was shared by all of the faculty at IRAAS. Like, there was no dogmatism here, right? Like, there was no, like, school of, like, you could be an Afrocentric, you could be a Black nationalist, you could be a Marxist, you could be intersectional, you could come however you were. You just had to be rigorous.
Right.
Because everyone would challenge you. And Manning would argue with us, the faculty would debate with us, they would force us to sharpen our ideas, but not necessarily force us to change our perspective. And that's really important. Like, there was no indoctrination going on at IRAAS. And Manning and I did not agree on everything about Malcolm X, and here I was having to talk about his work. And so that forced me to grapple with Malcolm X in a way that I think was challenging. And that was part of the continued legacy of that project. So, you know, being able to work at IRAAS in different capacities, as a student, as a TA, as a research assistant, as someone who worked on a conference, who was on the advisory editorial board of Souls, like all of these kinds of experiences, to tie in our first question, that was the praxis. Like, you didn't have to leave IRAAS to get involved and do and apply the work that we were doing. And then the other thing that spoke to was a deep faith in us. Right? That is also part of the theory, right? Like the idea that we are sufficient, our history is sufficient, our culture is sufficient, that we are very well capable of speaking and analyzing, but also of doing the work, right? So people came to IRAAS, we were empowered, we were enlightened, but we were also put to work. Within the institution, because that was part of what it meant to do this liberatory education.
Yeah, I think at the risk of being persnickety, it wasn't just that the faculty and staff with and connected to IRAAS believed that we could do what they expected us to do.
Yeah,
Yes.
absolutely.
And so for me, it is impossible to think about the beauty of IRAAS, and again, the people connected to it. So I just want to shout out again Sharon and Sean and the staff that make it work. But I think of IRAAS, I think of Souls, and I think of Aisha Khalifa Smart. It was impossible to get to class, no matter how you were with regard to time, walking down that hall, and Aisha not see you, and you have to stop and have a conversation with her. And she was one of the first people who embodied, I'm from Inglewood, California, and for me, Aisha embodied New York. The swag and the sophistication and the intelligence. And she would spend so much time talking to me about Uncle Jimmy, who, as a little black, same-gender-loving boy who struggled with understanding what that meant before I had access to the term, was everything. And she made him tangible and palpable, and in spite of the fact that I was never privileged enough to know him, I knew him through her. And Souls as a project allowed me, as someone who continues still to this day to take up space in Columbia, but knows that while I'm in it, I will never be of it. It allowed me to understand that we have both an obligation and an opportunity to be intentionally disruptive. And so traditional academies will say to you that the only way that you can become validated as an academician is to publish in one of their journals, to use their terms to talk about their supremacy in ways that make them comfortable. And Souls disrupted all of that. And said, let's leverage the best of all of the things that make us who we are and how we show up as scholars, even if we don't have the credentials that are afforded by this institution and those who can't pay for it or otherwise access it. Very real. And now as someone who is a scholar practitioner, who's been an elementary school teacher, a college professor, a policy advisor, and now a PhD student, not being beholden to the shackles of doing it their way, as demonstrated by that project, is something that continues to be instructive.
And Souls would be, for a number of us, the first publication that we had.
Yeah,
I mean, at least for me.
Not only the first, but the most important, right? Because to Zahir's point, like, you couldn't just write something and get up in Souls. Like, it wasn't just, some student journal.
Right, that's
It was rigorous, and that process is something that continues to be instructive. Secondly, and very quickly, I would not have been able to catch sense. There's a professor, Yolanda Celia Ruiz, who asked the question of when did you catch sense, understand where your purpose met your potential and power, if it were not for Farah Jasmine Griffin. She was my English teacher before I was introduced to IRAAS. And I don't know if you remember this or not, or if I've ever said this publicly, so just indulge me. But I remember getting a paperback early on in my career as a college student. And it was not the grade I was used to. And my little spirit was broken. Right, because in part when you like a smart black boy, people don't usually say like, what are we doing here? And so I remember going to Professor Griffin like, what happened? What did I do? How can I do better? And she said to me, this is good. But if you're willing to do the work, we can make sure that you get to be great. And so for years, while struggling with the hypocrisy of existing at an institution like Columbia, which purports to care about diversity, but operates in ways that are the antithesis of that, I was able to exist because of IRAAS. And I mentioned earlier in the introduction a book club. That word seems insufficient given the work that we did and Professor Griffin invested in us, where we read Barbara Ransby's book around Ella Baker. And I could not tell you in the way that our ancestors just lead us where we need to be so that we can show up at appointed times, that the things that we discussed in that book and the lessons that were described were things that I would be forced to use as a senior and still to this day as a professional. The responsibility of, at that time, answering to freshmen, younger students who in part would say that they were in school and graduate students because of me, and trying to find a way to show up in the face of white supremacy and anti-blackness was something that I could only do because of IRAAS and those who invested. And the short of it is that it is also why I am back. So I'm in a PhD program attempting to write about how it is that schools as an institution function to preserve the matrix of domination. And in particular, this is apropos because my senior thesis as a senior at Columbia was about Black masculine identity. And at the time, while I thought that I understood what theory and practice meant in that space, Professor Griffin helped challenge me to answer some profound questions about why I wanted to and desired to focus singularly on the experiences of Black men. And now, because of everything that I've read and have learned and have experienced, I'm able to develop a project around how it is that schools shape Black masculine identity. And in particular, erase the experiences of Black gay male high school students. So it connects right back to the brothers that I introduced y'all to earlier.
Thank you. So Natasha, I'm just also thinking about us going to Africana, going to the Rikers Island. And so I wanted to ask you that impact being a part of the Africana Criminal Justice Project and how it impacted you.
A huge impact. Actually, when you asked your first question about what are the different programs at IRAAS that I think about and how it affected my career, that's the first thing that I thought of. We were part of a team, and Russell was in that team as well as David, that went to Rikers Island, and we taught classes on the use of different Africana arts and political movements to really young incarcerated boys and young men on Rikers Island. They were supposed to be legally between the ages of 16 and I think 18. What we ended up finding is that many of them were way younger than 16. They had gotten picked up and used a cousin or a brother's papers for a wide variety of reasons. So really what we were doing was going every Friday, as you remember, to Rikers Island and just building with this amazing group of really, really young people who were locked up. And that was the first time I had ever been in any kind of correctional facility, whether a prison or a jail. It hugely informed everything that subsequently came in my career. It made me want to be a public defender, which is what made me ultimately want to be a civil rights lawyer. And as I was sitting here listening to all of you, I realized that when I think about basically every case I've worked on, it was a case that IRAAS in some way or another had already told me I needed to litigate or someone needed to litigate. And I can think of a billion examples. I have written some of them down here, but I worked on this death penalty case representing a client named Dwayne Buck. And when I think of that case and I think of conquering the specter that a prosecutor had created and superimposed onto this human being defendant. I think about conversations and a time when Professor Kendall Thomas from the law school came over and talked to us about the Wanda Jean Allen case. It was an amazing story and something I'll never forget, and that I thought about as I was working on this case for Mr. Buck. And when I think about our class and going to Rikers Island, I think about a murder case that I worked on for a defendant named David Jordan, who had been in and out of the system since he was a little boy, just like the ones who we were working with on Fridays at Rikers Island. I think about Dr. Marable having introduced me for the first time to the concept of prison-based gerrymandering in, I guess, 2003 or 2004, and then working on a case to defend ending that practice here in New York State. So IRAAS and all of the different programs, not just the classes, but the different things that we were able to do and were lucky to be able to do, formed a huge basis for my ability to dream up all of the things that we could litigate in the interest of racial justice, and so many things that I was lucky enough to have been able to do, and that so many people are still working on in a number of cases around the country.
Wow. Megan, you want to go?
So forgive me, because I'm going to speak in constellations right now, because I'm just taking in lots of different things. And my mom has asked me why I don't have a period at the end of any of my tattoos. It's because I'm still wandering. So bear with me through my rememories. I want to start just with what Zahir talked about being put to work, and how much faith was put in students to be at the fore. You know, in the work that I do now, I tell folks, my job is to be obsolete. My job is to not matter anymore, because that's when we're free. And I feel like there was a sense at IRAAS, which was home for me many years past the point that I had graduated from the master's program and entered a very different Columbia, a Columbia covered with white supremacy, that I really understood what that meant. And for me, and this is just one very short example, is I had worked on, before people were really thinking about how to translate Black studies into K through 12 curriculums, Dr. Marable was leading that charge. And New Jersey had created an Amistad Commission and had said, you know what, we're gonna work around this. And so he sent Zahir and I out to talk, and I think I was about 26 years old. And I was like, I don't know what the hell I'm doing, talking to teachers who literally could have taught me in high school. But there was that sense of faith that, like, your rigorous theory and practice and scholarship would inform what you were doing. And then, so that's just one little thought. Another speaks to the notion of dogmatism, right? And the lack of dogmatism. And it's something that I got reminded of. I had what I would call a real honor of sorting through the archives of Dr. Marable. And one of the things that was really beautiful about doing that was watching the trajectory of his thought change, where there were notes that were clearly part of the founding thoughts of how capitalism underdeveloped Black America, where he was writing a theory of Black socialism, right? And so we were given the opportunity not just to be that one thing, but to be everything, to be many things. And I, like Zahir, sort of entered the academy knowing I didn't want to be a part of it. And then the last thing I'll say is,
Look at us now.
I'm sorry. The last thing I'll say is this: when I did a PhD in history here, you go through a process of qualifying exams, and they're horrible and stupid. And so to make it better on myself, but also to piss the department off, I did my fourth field with Dr. Griffin. And around the theories around Black radical imagination. And I remember a professor on my committee saying to me, if you do this, you are never going to get a capital H history job. And I said, I don't ever want a job that doesn't demand that I do this. And that has been the foundation of IRAAS for me, and how I use my theory in my work all the time.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, just such wonderful conversation. The conversation about rigorousness, about the freedom to grow and develop. And one thing that I took from the programs, conversations and Malcolm X and Souls and all of that, that influenced my work is thinking about diasporic thinking, right? That Dr. Marable taught us that there's the connection between Blacks across the diaspora, and he very much brought the Black diaspora into the way I thought about the Black experience in America in a way that I had never thought about it before. And that expanded my thinking and thinking about Black more than just American Black, but that there's all kinds of experiences of Blackness. And it really informed my work on understanding whiteness and white supremacy from a diasporic perspective, and how it is that Black people have been able to utilize their understanding of the world and of white supremacy to be able to combat it. And all of these programs that we interacted with showed me that within these programs that Black people, as Zahir was saying, we have a way of knowing, we have a way of understanding the world already, right? That's sufficient enough to be able to attack white supremacy. So in the way that it informs my work and in the book I'm working on, American Whiteness, is by shining Blackness on whiteness, right? That it really brings white supremacy to the fore. So when you think about the way Black people have survived and created a community, the actions that they've done to be able to make themselves and remake themselves and to live as exhibited through these programs, that then opens up the world to us to be able to understand how it is that Black people are able to comment on white supremacy and understand that, and taking that information and being able to utilize that in our analysis. And so from thinking about the Black diaspora and how it is that all of these programs, through Malcolm's experiences, through Souls and the various things that shows that there is a whole diaspora of Blackness that can come together, and how it is that we can begin to understand the world. And that Black people, that all of these conversations, they represent an interdisciplinary framework that we can draw in the life of Malcolm X, that is a curriculum for understanding the world, that we can take the conversations of various scholars, and it helps expand our thinking on how it is that we should live and be in the world. And so I believe that the openness of these programs to provide a curriculum, to provide a context for interdisciplinary thinking, for diasporic thinking, to be able to solve the problems and conditions and speak to the problems in the world, I think are very important. And it really impacted the way in which I think about white supremacy by trying to understand what it means to be Black and what it has meant to be Black. And as you understand that, it opens up the world of white supremacy, and particularly American whiteness. And so in thinking about connecting the past through the present, through various documents in the living history, as Natasha was talking about, thinking about how it is that these various programs that we worked on open up this world to us for understanding what it means to be Black in a white supremacist world.
Thank you. So I'll just probably end with one more question. And I ask you to try to keep your comments to 2 minutes. Y'all know I'm bossy. So anyway, and then we will open it up to questions. So we are in a celebratory moment in a way where we've seen the materialization of the dreams of a number of people, and we've called some of those names, but I think it's also important to call Cheryl Green's name, as well as we've called Professor Blount's name, and the faculty that we have here who've really done the work to ensure that we have a department. And I was thinking, can our reflection also be guarded in addressing a cautionary tale such that the project of Black Studies continues to be reflexive, that there is a constant struggle with the institutions in which we inhabit, and what are some of the strategies and hopes, not only for the future of the department and the ongoing Institute for Research in African American Studies. So 20 years from now, what would you see the role of IRAAS and the department, the role of the students, faculty, alums, and communities engaged in the project of Black Studies, or African and African American diaspora studies? That's a long name.
I'll go ahead and just start and do reverse order. I think, as long as we continue to utilize the theories that we learn in Black Studies to be able to translate kind of the modern symbols of white supremacy in society and utilize those theories to kind of speak to the new and translate the new things that are coming up in our day-to-day society, all various types of inequality and inequities in society. I think that'll keep us on the right track. Again, the theory and practice and praxis and wrapping that and tying that back together, that our work then is about impacting communities. There'll be new versions of that as time goes on. And as long as we continue to utilize our research and our work to make a difference in those areas of American society and around the world that we want to change, I think that that is a way that that we're able to make a difference. And then without necessarily having to already be in a position of kind of responding to outside forces, but to realize that within ourselves, that we have the knowledge base, we have the systems, we have the culture, we have the ways of knowing for creating beauty, for surviving, and for expressing ourselves in all kinds of ways that demonstrate our capacity for change and our capacity for beauty and for development and growth. And so bringing those two things together, I think, is how it is that we can continue to advance the importance of kind of Black studies and IRAAS going forward.
Okay. So God bless all of you who have stayed in academia, really. And I think the way that I would answer this question is to talk about your responsibility, because there is a responsibility, and it's part of what was created at IRAAS and remains sort of the fundamental difference between IRAAS and a lot of Black Studies programs across the country, is this reality that there were programs all over in communities that were lessening the distance between the ivory tower and marginalized communities. And for me, in these, just to go back to these reading groups that we've been doing in conjunction with the National Council, I'm going to get this right, National Council of Formerly and Currently Incarcerated Black Women, is we have been doing the work of reading these like seminal texts of Black studies, but we are not often, not me, but the women that I work with are not often invited to those tables. They're not invited to these rooms. And there is, the call to action is to begin to lessen that distance even further. So as we are moving forward, we are creating all sorts of kinds of scholars, and that it doesn't demand a degree for people to be educated both in theory and in praxis.
Mm-hmm. Well said.
So super tactically, a thought that I have, Zinga, when you mentioned like what will IRAAS be in 20 years, is to keep doing what we've talked about this afternoon that I think is so amazing about IRAAS, which is to have an academic space that's not purely academic, basically to offer, in addition to traditional classes in a classroom, practicum and clinical type offerings so that we can do exactly what Megan is saying, which is actually take the things that we're learning and act as young people, understand how to operationalize the things that we're reading about and talking about. And I think our class where we went to Rikers is a great example of that. And I would love to see IRAAS continue to do more of that. I know that that's been a theme throughout the history of the institution, which is amazing. And I would love for us to keep being that.
One of the things that's interesting, and I just remembered this, and people may not know this, but back in the day, IRAAS had a membership system where community members could buy a membership, and they would get the Souls Journal and get the conversation, and that just kind of speaks to the spirit of IRAAS not being a traditional, not seeing and conceiving itself as a kind of traditional academic department. I think I'm so pleased and so overjoyed to see that IRAAS, that had, kind of become an academic department. But I don't want us to pat Columbia on the back so quickly, because it's late. It is late in the game. There have been departments at comparable schools long before this one. So we should start there. And as I love that little corner in the Skirmerhorn building at 758. But they just like stuck us there on that same floor. They also stuck the women's studies, just like that little corner where the black and queer corner, where many of us believe the Manhattan Project started. So what I'm thinking is that part of this is to think about how these institutions respond. Many of the Black Studies departments in the late 60s, early 70s were established under threat of violence, at gunpoint sometimes, of student-occupied buildings. And so we also are in a moment where institutions are having to respond to Black Lives Matter. Let's not, in the spirit of making sure we're contextualizing what's happening, they're looking, these institutions are kind of looking, across Morningside Park and seeing the rise of agitation, whether it's Black Lives Matter or the movement to call institutions to be accountable for their role in slavery and for profiting off of slavery. And so there is this kind of navigating between, there are people who have genuine belief and faith in African American and African studies as a discipline, and then there are people within these institutions who are really cynical, which is like, give them something so they don't make too much of a fuss. Right? And what I'm saying, we have to use both. We have to use the hope where we find it, but also use the cynicism where we find it to extract what we need to extract. So I would say for alums, for current students, for faculty, do not let up, right? Do not feel like, oh, it's a department, we're done, we're good. No, make sure you keep agitating. 25 years from now, I want IRAAS to have its own building. Right? I want to, buildings plural. I want to see the growth of that space. And that's not going to happen if we just we didn't, Manning and his successors didn't just stop at an institute. They fought and fought and fought to establish a master's program. And they didn't just stop at a master's program. They fought and fought, now they have a department. Hopefully a PhD program is on its way. A building, keep, again, playing on hope, but also where there is no hope in these institutions that are cynical, extract what you need to extract from them.
Yeah, I appreciate that. What I think about is that white supremacy wins when we stop doing the work of agitating and demanding. And the blessing and curse of needing to have an IRAAS is accepting the sad reality that we don't ever really get a chance just to enjoy the victories.
That's right.
Right? There's always something else to do. So in the spirit of what Natasha said, I want to honor that it is clear, if only by a demonstration of how brilliant the manifestation of IRAAS continues to be, including those of you who are not sitting up here but very much could for lots of reasons, that what IRAAS has done, it needs to continue, right? And for me, that is giving the most brilliant and privileged of us the tools to dismantle the master's house. And then I think that for me, I accept the responsibility that Zahir laid out for those of us who are alums and current students and will be responsible for shaping future students, is to equip them with the skills, not only the cognitive skills you need to show up and show out in classrooms, but the social and emotional skills to do that when your classmates and professors tell you that you're crazy for wanting to do it. And so I accept on the record my responsibility to use this degree that I'm going to get to own leveraging technology so that the best parts of IRAAS are accessible to more students, in particular students who are least likely to be able to have access to spaces like Columbia because of their marginalized intersectional identities.
And one last thing I think is important. Our professors, Professor Griffin, Stephen Gregory, Marcellus, and others engage in a practice of having compassion. And even though we, I don't want to seem to be, too flowery, but this idea of having compassion for students, for people in the community. I just went to conversations last week. It's comprised with people in the community. It wasn't just all faculty and academics, but also teaching and engaging people of how to be and how to be kind to one another. And while that probably won't go in a brochure somewhere, it's important in the ways in which our interaction with the people that we profess to care about so much. And so I just want to kind of leave it on that note, and then now just open it up for questions. There's no mic, I don't think, but
I can share and they can use this one.
I can give you one. Okay.
But we should use it, however, because some people might be impaired. Some people might be impaired in their recording. When we think about including people who might have disabilities, we should use the tools.
Everybody's got them. Okay.
That's right.
Marable Manning invited me here himself because I met him at the Breck Forum, which I've gone to for years and years and years. I work as a tourist guide. So when you talk about doing work on the ground, I've told people all over the world about Harlem. I've got shot at on buses giving tours in Harlem. I got shot at twice in one night because I tell people about Black history, and it was before what they say, Jamestown, first Black was here, 1609. A Black man was left here by the Dutch East India Company. And he was the one who learned to speak to the Native Americans. You all don't tell them about that. I do. And they come and see me and other people like me who talk Black history, and that's why I get shot at. And I don't care, because if they kill me, I'm coming back with all the demons in hell. If they don't want to learn Black history and give Black people what they need to get, we're going to take it. That's right. And I'm going to be 70 years old in a couple of minutes. I'm still out here. and Jasmine has been giving lectures in nightclubs, honey. Remember that time when Jasmine was giving lectures in a nightclub? See, y'all can't sit up in the university. Most Black people, even if they got enough guts, and I will use intestinal fortitude, they go out, but they're scared to come into a white university like this. You got to go out. I take IRAAS's brochures and give them to people on the street. And some people have come up to Columbia and they were kind of scared. I said, no, come on up and listen to what folks have to say. And they say, I don't understand the word. I said, you got the biggest computer in the world in your hand. It's called a smartphone. Learn how to use it. And I told them to look up people like her. And when she wrote about all them black women singers and everything else, see, they can understand stuff like that. But y'all can't sit up here and wait for them to come to you. They're not, I'll come up here and I'll go into the biggest, baddest neuroscientist office, my boy Carl. But you got to get out and tell folks.
That's right.
Don't just wait for them to come to you because they're not going to. They're scared. I mean, they'll go to work reluctantly, some of them. I love going to work because I can talk longer and better, but you got to get out there and do the work.
That's right.
Not just to those who have degrees or alums and undergrads and grads and post-grad and this grad and the other grad. I don't care. But just get out there and do it. Like I said, when I met Manning Marable, I was at his house at a party with Leith and everything else. I go to every college now and go to college classes and talk. Good. Because folks need to know that, folks, we built this country.
That's right.
And if I don't get a good share, I'm going to take it down. Right?
Right.
I am. Hey, as I tell people, I have Cain and I am able. And black folks know who Cain and Abel is. And if I see any of you using my phrase, you got a copyright suit.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for your reflections. I'm Yusuf Caruso, the African Studies Librarian at Columbia University. I don't know if any of you know who I am. I've been doing this job for 25 years, building a collection on the study of Africa and being the watchdog for materials about the African diaspora, particularly outside of the United States. Although there are people I work with who handle Latin America or Europe or the Indian Ocean, but I'm always sort of checking in and making sure that we have what we need to understand the global African world. But I question is, what will it take to change the K through 12 curriculum in this country, even at the local level, to incorporate all the knowledge that's in this library that I've been building and that you have all benefited from about African peoples. Not just the tragedies, but the triumphs. Mm-hmm. And what will it take to train the teachers who will teach that curriculum in this country? I think that's one of the challenges that I always had in the back of my mind when I'm building this collection, but not having the time to do a lot of the outreach or to do the training of the teachers. I know some of you are doing some of that kind of work, but I don't understand. Some of the requirements are there on the New York State curriculum guide, but the teachers don't have any knowledge at all in order to take up that material. And they don't have the leadership from the principals in their schools or, at the DOE. What will it take? This is 2019.
So Brian Stevenson said at a conference years ago, and I'll never forget it, and it speaks to the question of, how do we grapple with not understanding things that don't make sense? He said, imagine for a second that the systems work exactly as they're intended to. It is not by happenstance that 98% of the workforce is comprised, the K-12 teaching workforce is comprised of white women, especially at a point in time in which the current occupant of the Oval Office is a racist tyrant who has employed a woman to lead the Department of Education who knows absolutely nothing about public education other than dismantling it. and at a point in time in which we continue to improperly refer to students who show up as a global majority as minority.
Yes.
So I'm just like pointing out the contradictions to help us just acknowledge that it's not supposed to make sense, right? Like, because the schools weren't designed to liberate us. And so I think practically there are at least three things that lead us closer to the answer. And one is us leveraging the ability to connect theory and practice to change the way that we have conversations about why elections matter. Betsy DeVos should not be anywhere near a federal appointment responsible for anything, period. She's a rich white woman, the definition of white privilege, who is now responsible for K-12 education and is paid to dismantle it, to disrupt democracy tangibly every single day. And I think that if we find more meaningful ways to say to people, it is important for you to vote every single year in every single election, and not just because people died for it, but because they have consequences and we can hold people accountable, then it might allow us to move past that hurdle. The second thing is that we have to find ways to leverage the systems that exist in order to prioritize truth-telling around the experiences of African descendants. If we were to get the College Board, those responsible for the ACT, the SAT, AP programs, and IB programs to value the teaching and learning of diasporic history, it would be taught because they could then test it and they could then have people pay for it. Absent that, we will continue to have theoretical conversations about the distinction between the federal rights and states' roles in education and grapple with control of curriculum. The very last thing to your question of acknowledging all of those things being very true, and that there are tangible efforts right now underway in a lot of cities, including New York, to recruit more of us to be K-12 teachers, we have to do the work of increasing cultural competence. Both my PhD work as well as the work that I lead at the National Black Justice Coalition is anchored in sitting in institutions and having conversations with people to check them on their ignorance and highlight the responsibility that they have when they walk into spaces where they assume responsibilities of being teachers for doing better, for practicing critical humility, for honoring student voice, for learning more about history, context, and oppression. That work takes time. And the reality is that too often it also takes somebody dying, a kid being bullied, or national moments of crisis for people to feel like it's important enough work to do. But that's the tough work that it takes in order for us to dismantle some of these systems.
Can I add to that? So I think it's critical to note that the first blueprint for a prison in the United States was designed alongside the first blueprint for a school in the United States. And then that was in the living room of Benjamin Franklin as he was a slaveholder. So to speak to David's point, like, this is a system that is working perfectly. My mother taught for 35 years in the Boston public schools, and she called me the other day and told me that one of the questions on the standardized tests that her kids took this year was a question asking them to grapple with the idea of whether slavery was just from the position of the slave owner. So that's where we're at in 2019. We're at a place where only 2% of teachers have ever taken any sort of Black or ethnic studies class. We're in a place where Teach for America, which are not teachers, 5 weeks of training does not a teacher make, are taking over schools. We are eroding the system of public education further and further every day. We do not value it on the basic premise of public education, let alone value it for anything that looks like cultural competency, right? And so if we need to, as Megan as a citizen, needs to begin, it's not just about voting, because I think voting is really important, but it's also about, like, saying that we have to dismantle these structures and build new ones, not in the form of privatized charter schools, but in the form of what public education should look like, which should reflect history and also teach civics.
Yeah.
And if I could just make one comment, and for us to get involved. So some of us who come through IRAAS are going to have to be teachers, elementary teachers.
A lot of us
Yes, I know, as far as college, but even,
No, I'm talking about
yeah.
elementary education.
Yeah, so just staying involved in that. And I don't know, we have a program of teaching the teachers. I know that we've done that like for higher ed, but even as elementary ed, many schools do that. So from a practical standpoint, having the programs of teaching the teachers so that they can come through the institute to be able to get that type of training.
Yeah, there's a summer, at least for the last 2-3 years, there's been a summer institute that brings teachers to get the exposure. I mean, so one of the things is to, you know, when, on the more practical thing, when you if anyone who's taught, like, you just get sucked into that thing. And it's very rare that you get a chance to keep up on the latest scholarship, to keep up on the latest ideas. And then some of us in the academy brilliantly are articulating ideas and concepts that are not as accessible to teachers who just need, like, I need a handout and I need like a short 2-paragraph prompt for my students to read.
Give it to me in a video,
Yeah,
put it on
and I think so
Instagram.
part of that is something that we also have to think about, and, you know, and I think IRAAS was well positioned for that. And really, you know, this is what, you know, the thing about Black studies in general, it's always been a public-facing discipline. It has never been about, like, we are just like a bunch of people who are, like, writing for committee, which is what the academy is, right? Like, you write your book in response to someone else's book, and this is a real incestuous conversation that's happening within a small group of people. Black studies was always very public-facing, and I think IRAAS has always been in that spirit too, but that's something that we, you know, on the more practical level, like, we have to, you can't just, like, bring a teacher to your library collection and say, here. Like, it has to be, you know, we need to have curriculum writers and people who are skilled in knowing how things need to be formatted and accessed by teachers. You know, that's something that I know that I'm working on at Brooklyn Historical Society. We do the Chancellor Days when the teachers do professional development. They come in and we, like, walk them through the curriculum, the content, as well as the means by which to access this for, you know, for their students.
And having done one of those talks at the Brooklyn Historical Society is literally providing teachers with practical civic lessons or whatever your area of concentration would be, as I did probably 2 years ago. So, I mean, there are avenues for you to do this work and make it relevant specifically for those who are in historical societies or libraries. Do we have any other questions?
Not a question. Suggestion, make a YouTube video.
Yes, ma'am.
I'm studying that now
No,
because they look at YouTube.
Yeah, they do.
Does anybody know who Callum Scott and Leona Lewis are? Biggest name in music right now. She's a Black Brit, and he's a white Brit, and he's gay. And they got this great song going, and it's one of the most highly downloaded songs on YouTube. But he's singing to her and she's singing to him, but everybody knows who's what and who. But they see a pretty black woman and a pretty white man from the UK singing wonderful love songs, and they pay money for it. You got to do covert action, honey. Covert warfare.
Do we have any other questions? Yes. And this will be our last question, so.
Thanks, everybody. I'm wondering, this might get you all to restate some things you've already said, but maybe as a way of tying it together. And I'm thinking about a conversation I've had previous with Zahir about, so if we think about this is being the 25th year of IRAAS, in what ways has IRAAS's existence on this campus forced a change in the very definition of the university? And I'm thinking about university as a site for knowledge production. How has that been? Because I'm also thinking about the way in which one of y'all mentioned that IRAAS had this laboratory-like model. I come from the oral history program here, the idea of a laboratory, the idea of a public facing, the idea of something that's much more engaged. Again, these are all themes that you all have brought up, but I'm wondering if there might be a way to advance the conversation around this theme of knowledge production specifically.
So I'll take this on. I'm going to go back to talking about the two Columbias I experienced. No shame, I did a PhD in history here. And it was an entirely different experience. And it was, I would say it was shell-shocking. I remember calling my mom the day of orientation, so I hadn't even been in a classroom. But to walk into a cohort where I was the only woman, and there was not a single black or brown person in the room, was shell-shocking to me after having spent 2 years at IRAAS. And I called my mother from the bathroom and I said, I don't want to be here anymore. And she said, you just got here. You better go back and get that degree. That's another story. But what happened in that moment, and now I get to pay tribute to the people before me in that program, Zahir, I see Russell somewhere there, there was a cohort of scholars who had continued to utilize IRAAS as a space to create safe, and safe is actually a really important term when you're talking about these spaces on Columbia's campus, safe and intellectual space for students. And this was years before Black Lives Matter. The group was called Black Historians Matter. And I think we met once a month. And there were these cross-sectional conversations that happened. Some of it was eating. I don't remember if there was drinking. I didn't drink at that time. So that was a goody two-shoes. But there was, ultimately, it was about having safe space to share ideas and learn, and there was so much power in that. And I remember when the folks matriculated on, and I was left without that space, and how crippling that was to the work that I was doing. And so for me, it's about students and faculty and alumni reimagining what freedom dreams are, to quote Robin Kelly, and imagining small spaces that make huge differences in people's intellectual development and their liberation.
So this is one of those spaces, and some of y'all watched me just experience one of those moments. So I just want to name it. And honor that, I appreciate the question because it allows me to double down on that and demonstrate how IRAAS gives you the tools to show up as your full self and demand that the world changes around you. So I am David Johns. I'm a Black boy from Inglewood, California. I am an educator. I am a son. I'm a political wonk. I'm a lot of things. I used the term earlier to identify who I love for those that it matters to. And the term that I use is same gender loving. I use the term because names matter, our identities matter, and specifically because gay is a term that is used as a white political identifier to refer to privileges that people who don't look like me, who are responsible for the continued oppression of people who share my identities. And it is often one of the things that does not allow people for whom they have heterosexual, non-normative sexual identities and gender orientations to take up spaces in rooms like this. And so what I heard in the reference, and I know she didn't intend it, what I heard at that moment was a totalizing and a dismissing of all the most important parts of my identity in spite of all of the work that I've done and the investments that people have made in me. But the reality is, it happened because I'm equipped to be able to deal with it. And so I think it's important to name what happened and how I responded to it, and to offer up that context so that nobody else does what happened to anybody else.
Thank you, David. And so with that said, we are concluding the roundtable for today. Thank you so much, panelists. You indeed are, brilliant and amazing. And those of you who are alumni, please continue to provide us with your information so that we can continue to be in contact with you. Thank you.